too.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to this afternoon's session of the conference. And we start off, I think, with a subject which actually Melvyn Bragg set up rather nicely in his comments on the awards, the licence fee and the implications of what happens to the licence fee payments for over 75s. And to lead the discussion, I'd like to welcome a man who knows more about the licence fee than many people, having been Chief Executive of BBC Broadcast, Managing Director of Television, and therefore the beneficiary of many hundreds of millions of pounds worth from the licence fee. And he's also, of course, a VLV patron. I'm going to ask Will Wyatt, CBE, to chair this session, and he's going to introduce the other panellists. So over to you, Will.
Thank you, Colin. I hope the money was well spent. I think most of it was. I couldn't swear for every last pound, I fear, in retrospect. Anyway, the subject of this session is this. I just came back from a couple of weeks in the Lake District over Easter, and there it was waiting for me. Please, Mr. Wyatt, find your new free over 75 licence. Notional value, £154.50, no fee due. And indeed, when I first became eligible for this a couple of years ago, I was surprised not to get a letter from the BBC suggesting that I gave them the money, but I didn't get it, so I didn't give them the money. And now, interesting enough, that £154.50 I checked was worth, in 1968, when the first colour licence came in, it was £10, and that's £172 according to the Office of National Statistics inflation calculations. Now, as you know, the government currently funds fees for licence payers over 75, and under the last agreement, the BBC was slipped a hospital pass, which means that as from next year, it's the BBC who funds free licence fees for over 75s or whatever decision they take about how that benefit will continue. As Melvyn said, I think we all agree that it's ridiculous that the BBC should be asked to act as an agent of social policy, but there we are. That's what happened. We will go into that perhaps a little in this discussion. I certainly hope so. The VLV conducted a survey on this, in which 81% of members who responded opposed the continuation of this existing benefit, and 50% of those who were against the continuing it would support some form of concession for the elderly. Now, to help us and the BBC find a way through all this, we have with us this afternoon Claire Enders, founder of Enders Analysis, a leading, many would say the leading research company in this technology, media and telecom sector. The company states that its work is independent, impartial and grounded in analysis, uninfluenced by the stock market and or corporate finance considerations. It's proud of its accurate record of predictions. We may well ask you for one later, Claire. Caroline Abrahams, at the end there, is Charity Director of Age UK, social scientist and barrister who's had senior roles in charities and the public sector, and was a policy advisor to both ministers and shadow ministers. Age UK, as you know, is the country's largest charity working for older people. It seeks, and I quote, to make sure that every older person is respected, protected, and treated with dignity. Caroline leads Agent UK's influencing work, and she'll be influencing us this afternoon. And then thirdly, in the centre there, Richard Ayre was a BBC journalist working at the corporation for nearly 30 years, and among his senior roles, he was Controller of Editorial Policy, Deputy Chief Executive of BBC News, and he's a former member of the Ofcom Content Board. And perhaps most relevantly for this discussion, Richard was a member of the BBC Trust, the body which replaced the BBC governors and existed until 2017. And his period on the Trust covered the period that the last funding decision for the BBC took place. So it was close to that, and we'll look back forward to his thoughts. But first I'd like to go to Claire, if I may, a disinterested analyst, from the outside and an analytical point of view, tell us what your thoughts are on this, which is a conundrum, I think, for the BBC.
It is. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the VLV folks for inviting me to appear yet again. So this is really the most unpleasant issue that the BBC has faced since the set of issues around the future of the corporation during a particularly sticky patch when John Whittingdale was the Secretary of State for the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. And this is, in fact, this current crisis is, in fact, as a result of the previous crisis, which the BBC fudged, essentially, and accepted, I think, and, you know, there's no point in going back in time, but after that particular settlement, you know, there was the Brexit issues, the Prime Minister changed, the government has, as we can all see, stopped functioning generally. And therefore, we are in a situation today which has been brought about by a certain number of legal measures, and which I think if the government were functioning fully, that it would have addressed this issue already, and it would have a resolution. Now, let me just tell you what the resolution is so that I won't bore you with the rest of it. I'll just get the resolution out of the way. And then if we could all go and proselytize this resolution, it might help a little. So the resolution is this. The BBC has, by law, another opportunity to have a license fee settlement in 21-22. And in this document, which is available, as I'm sure you know, to everyone who's a member of VLV, because we're very happy for everyone to read our work, particularly at VLV, and everywhere else. So in this document, we basically say that our very strong preference would be to roll this issue into the 21-22 license fee settlement, which would be an extraordinarily pragmatic way to deal with it. This would also enable, you know, the balancing of the two fundamentals of the issue, which is one, what kind of concession is available to what portion of the 4.5 million households that currently get a free concession, number one. And secondly, what is the BBC license fee going to be in 21-22 going forward? Those are two very strongly, in my view, completely related issues, because Ofcom has given the BBC a remit, and parts of that remit are of extraordinary importance for the UK's role in the world. I'm really talking about the news services, the World Service, and so on. So that would be my resolution, and I really do think, as someone who has been in this country for 40 years, almost, that the powers that be and the ministers and the DCMS, all the people who would be involved would be arriving at this conclusion, or would have arrived at it already, and would be proselytizing this, and this would be something that would be called a fudge. A lovely fudge in which no one has to take responsibility for not having observed the absolute letter of whatever the deal was when John Whittingdale was the Secretary of State. A deal I have to say he has responded to me repeatedly in saying he was unhappy about that deal, very unhappy about it, and feels that he bears a very heavy responsibility for something that was not entirely his responsibility at all. Anyway, so that's that would be my fudge, and I hope that would help, because I think pushing off the issue rather than imposing upon the BBC to alter this concession by June 2020, i.e. by next year, and then if as I think we all feel, the result would be one in which there is means testing. The BBC would be setting up a means testing organization, and within 5 minutes of doing that at some cost and expense, it would be discussing a new license fee with the government. I think that the issue I have with the way the government has dealt with this so far is that it is bound to outrage millions of people that they will be paying for their license fee. It is bound to do this. The number of households that we believe would be affected, would continue with a concession, cannot be more than 20%, i.e. around 1 million households. So there'll be 3.5 million extraordinarily angry people, and 2 million of those households also contain people under the age of 75. I have to say, with the issues around Brexit, if I were the government, I wouldn't be touching this one with a barge pole. Anyway, that is my, humble view about what the government should do, but we're not in a position now to actually get that through. There is a small chance, I would put it at no more than 15%, that the powers that be, who understand that this is the right way to deal with this, who would have dealt with this in this way if we had a functioning government, that they will do this. So Our position has been all along that it is absolutely intolerable and inappropriate for the BBC to be put in this impossible position. We have supported the Age UK position. I know the VLV position is slightly different, but we have worked with Gordon Brown to get the number of people to sign that petition at 100,000, which is the most extraordinary success for Age UK. And I think it's an amazing charity, and I'm a strong backer of it. So we are not in favor of any reduction in the services of the BBC. We were very unhappy to hear Ofcom say that they would vary the remit of the BBC as soon as necessary. We do not view any part of the BBC's current activities as being subject to change without further consultation. We had that consultation, but in 2015, 2016, and therefore the public has already made its views known in very large number. Now, how the BBC is actually going to deal with this is relatively simple in my view, because they are obliged to go with the results of the consultation as they did last time. That is the right way to deal with it. I'm sure they will deal with it in that way, and we await to hear what it is. I find it hard to believe that the BBC does not have many supporters out there who also view that the existing set of services that it has is absolutely the right one. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Karen. Just in terms of the process going forward, I mean, you can, 745 million is the figure that is said that the BBC will lose into income if they go fully ahead with this. You can cut it a lot of different ways, but it's the cost of BBC 2, BBC 4, Radio 4, and half of local radio, or carve it in various other ways.
You can't even go there. It's just
No,
so enormous that it's like, it's immovable, right?
It would change the nature of the organisation in every possible way. But going forward, I mean, over time, usually there's been a consultation or discussion with government, or sometimes a lead in the BBC, about what the remit of the BBC should be. Then there's a negotiation about how that should be funded to whatever level. Is that how you would see it happening if things, were as you wish them to be?
Absolutely, because, the remit is, the delivery is regulated by Ofcom. So, in fact, anything that alters the remit has to be reconsulted on. So yes, the BBC, if it were proposing to remove £250 million of expenditure from its existing service level, which is around 250 to 300 million, would be the cost of the license fees for those households that we believe will meet the requirement threshold for a concession. So that 300 million is 2/3 of radio expenditure. Yeah, I mean, any number that comes up, even the best number, is a ginormous and horrifying number. And also, you've got to remember, it's not just, say, 300 million for those concessions. It's for 8 years' worth. So as I've explained it to most people, this is either characterized as a £6 billion problem at the 745 level, or it's characterized as a £1.5 billion problem. But whatever it is, it's an enormous amount of money coming out of programming, out of programmers, out of the richness of our cultural life. This is a big one.
Caroline, clearly you would wish, and your members would wish, and I guess most of the people in this room would wish, that what benefits are possible for older people should be maintained in most circumstances. Lay out your position, for those who don't know it, for how you would approach this problem, or you think it should be approached by government and the BBC.
Yep, fine. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here, but I'm really sorry to be here, actually, at one level, because the only reason I'm here is in your meeting, in your conference, is because of something that's a real potential threat to television, broadcasting, the BBC. And, we have no desire at Age UK to be in this position at all. We have no beef with any of those things. We have been dragged into this, really, because of the action that George Osborne took all those years ago, a slowly ticking bomb that's finally gone off, essentially, and leaving our government with a difficult decision to know what to do about it, and the BBC in particular in a really bad place. So Age UK exists to advance the interests of older people, particularly the most vulnerable, whether that's because they're on a very low income, or they're chronically lonely, or they're very unwell, or they have unmet care needs. And we spend most of our time dealing with all those sorts of issues. And as you'll be aware, there are a series of universal entitlements in place for older people at the moment. They come in at different stages and ages. They were created in a somewhat ad hoc way over the years. They include the concessionary bus pass and the extra bits that you get in London. We have the winter fuel allowance and various other things. And of course, we have the free TV licence for over 75s. A kind of curious one, really, because it comes in so late. It's the latest of the concessions, because after all, once you get to 75, you really are, there's no pretense that you're not an older person by that stage. You're not in your first youth at that stage, which is not to say that a lot of people aged 75 are extremely fit and well and enjoying life to the full. But nonetheless, I think you're not a spring chicken anymore, we could safely assume. And the reason those universal benefits were really established is because actually they're there partly to compensate for a state pension, which is set much lower than is the case in most other parts of Europe and in comparable countries. So the average pensioner only receives about £7,000 a year in their state pension. Now, if that's all you've got to depend on, obviously life is very tough. And there is a means-tested benefit that people can claim in those circumstances called pension credit. It's a means-tested benefit. I'm telling you this for a purpose. And there's a problem with it, which is that over many years, despite loads of efforts, fairly half-hearted efforts, I think, from governments successively, rather better, stronger efforts from people like myself and my colleagues at Age UK, 1 in 3 of all the older people who are entitled to that pension credit don't get it. And the problem is, and you just need to think about this, means testing doesn't really work with older people. The reason it doesn't work is not really totally understood, but we just know, however hard you try, lots and lots of older people don't claim. They don't claim for lots of reasons, because they think they're not entitled, because they think it might be for someone, not them, because they don't want to be beholden to the state and they're proud and independent, because they have dementia, because they have cognitive decline, because they're unwell, because they're defeated by the length and the intrusiveness of the form. But what all this boils down to is that means testing doesn't really work for older people, and it's an absolute surefire thing that however marvellous any means-tested scheme would be for anything, we can rest assured that 1 in 3 probably, all the people that really, really need it, won't get it. So just store that away in your minds. Now, our position at Age UK isn't that those universal entitlements are all sacrosanct. The really big fight that we have on at the moment is to try and improve social care in this country. And there may be people in the audience who have direct personal experience of that, or from people that they know. The system's in real crisis. And it may well be, as part of an eventual settlement to improve social care in this country, some of those universal benefits may have to go into the pot and be traded, and we would certainly bear that in mind. The problem we've got with this is it was taken off the table. It's just money for the government. It puts us, older people, the BBC, in an impossible position, and it doesn't do any of us lot any good whatsoever. And it's, even if we were minded to trade it later on, it's not even there to be traded. And our real worry, if you've read anything about this or heard anything on broadcast, I won't bore you with it, but significant numbers of older people above the age of 75 are not very well off. They would struggle to meet a bill of £150 a year, or even if it was less, how would you make it less? Are you saying that if you raise the age to 80, well, there's plenty of people aged 75 and 80 who are very poor. It's actually regressive, frankly, if you do that. It's because obviously, people who are less well off tend to live less long. So you'd actually be penalising those people, especially in the north, especially as a north-south element to all of this. There are lots and lots of older people. We've been actually very interested in lots of ways about just how strongly lots of older people feel, how much they love their television, their BBC in particular, I think it would be fair to say. And it's kind of sad at one level that it feels as though they've been somewhat taken for granted by our broadcaster, who I have very friendly conversations with colleagues from the BBC. The excitement's about, the next digital thing, the app and all the rest of it. But meanwhile, there is a large group of older people for whom their television is their life, it's their lifeline, it's their link to our democracy, it's how they find out about what's going on in the world, and sometimes it's the only voice they'll hear, not only all day or week. You know all this because we've said this a lot, so I won't, I won't bore you with it. But so for us, in summary, we think it's important that this isn't just taken away. We don't see any of the solutions that have been put forward by the BBC as runners. We are very sympathetic, really, to the position they're in. We do not attack the BBC in our statements. If you read what we have to say, you know, we're cross with the government, and we're particularly cross with George Osborne and this government for not calling it out. But that's basically our position.
Caroline. None of the BBC's proposed options you say do you like?
No.
You don't think the government are cruel and heartless? What's going to happen then? What would you do?
Well, we'll have to wait and see, won't we? I mean, an interesting thought that Claire had. It's open to the government at any moment to take it back. They could. It's not difficult for them to do. Of course, it's a lot of money, but in government terms, it's 3 and 6, really. It's not that much for them. And they've chosen to hide behind the BBC. Even yesterday in the opposition debate, if you read it, the digital minister, Margot James, very nice woman, long track record of supporting older people, personally and professionally. I'm sure she hated every minute of having to be at the dispatch box yesterday, defending a decision which really is somewhat indefensible. There was no public discussion about it. It was all behind closed doors. You know, I think it's a very shabby sort of state of affairs, really. We still haven't given up hope that something will change and they'll change their minds. And, you know, elections, referenda, or, you know, we're in such political turmoil at the moment, anything's possible. And that's an opportunity, I think, more than a risk at the moment for this issue.
Okay, thank you.
I wish.
Richard, now, you were on the BBC Trust when this came into play. How come that the Trust gave in and accepted such an open-ended deal, one that it must have been clear at the time was going to bring terrific trouble to the BBC's finances, indeed it's their capability of delivering services?
Thanks, all. And thanks to the VLV. The last time you were kind enough to ask me here, I was one of the 12 trustees who were under imminent sentence of death as the last charter came to an end. So I was able to speak then with the degree of license afforded to the condemned man and to atone for some of my past crimes, but also to attack the blatant injustice of the system which was sending us to the gallows. So since then, I've been taken down, still half living, but I'm now not in any way representing the BBC view, nor aware of what the BBC's decision-making is going to lead to over the next couple of months on this subject. I should, for the sake of transparency, declare that in this calendar year I have received the sum of £400 from the BBC for a number of days' work at an hourly rate which is illegal. To answer Will's question, I like to think that if Will or Colin or I had still been on the staff of the BBC in 2000 when Gordon Brown came up with this doubtless well-intentioned wheeze, we would have seen that it was a poisoned chalice. Because unquestionably, Gordon Brown genuinely, I think, wanted to help pensioners. The way to do that effectively would have been to pay a higher state pension to allow pensioners who could not otherwise afford it to pay for their licence fee. Instead of that, he decided that the BBC should be given a lump sum from the DWP in respect of the over 75's. It should have been clear, and frankly, it must have been clear that there was a high risk in the BBC going along with that deal, because although it would have been impossible for a future government to withdraw the additional funding from individual pensioners, it must always have been likely that although Gordon Brown believed that we'd seen the end of boom and bust, no other economist in the world believed that that was the case. So it must always have been likely that one day government would come along looking for austerity cuts, and this curious payment from the DWP to the BBC would be a likely candidate. Having said that, even if the BBC foresaw it at the time, you can understand the attractions of the deal, because not only did it give the BBC a guaranteed lump sum, it also avoided the possibility of evasion among over 75 licensees, the very people who it would have been most publicly indefensible to prosecute for their failure to pay up. So, wide forward 10 years from Gordon Brown, and George Osborne came along with his first attempt. to pass the buck to the BBC. And as you know, thanks partly to other political opposition, but significantly to threats of resignation by Mark Thompson, who was then DG, and the then chairman of the BBC Trust, Osborne backed off. And I think it's fair to say that the BBC itself, and certainly the trustees, recognised that with austerity still a major priority for George Osborne throughout the first half of this decade, it was highly likely that George Osborne would come at the BBC again with this plan. What we failed to recognise, and this is my only mea culpa this afternoon, what we failed to recognise was that he might come at it separate from the charter negotiations. We'd absolutely expected a very tough charter negotiation, including debate about the licence fee. And we had believed that in any logical world, you begin with discussing the BBC's scope, the services it would be expected to provide, then move on to the finance that would be necessary to provide it. We did not foresee that about 8 weeks before the start of formal charter negotiations, the Chancellor would simply agree at a stroke to tell the BBC that it was being given immediate responsibility for finding this sum of money to pay for over 75s. Maybe we should have foreseen the possibility that it would come as us in advance of the charter negotiations, but we didn't. I happen to have been alone with Rona Fairhead on the morning, which was Monday, 29th of June, in her office, 2015, when her PA came in and said, the Secretary of State, John Whittingdale, needs to talk to you, Rona, and separately to Tony Hall immediately. So I left the room and the call was placed. It was a short call, and I went back into the room as soon as it was over to find Rona suitably shell-shocked. She told me that John Whittingdale had told her in no uncertain terms that the Chancellor had decided that the BBC would now take responsibility for the payment of over 75s, that the Chancellor would announce it on Wednesday, that was 2 days later, and that he, John Whittingdale, and the Chancellor required the BBC to give their formal agreement to this plan by noon of that day, about 2 hours later. That's how government operates. What happened in the following 5 days will probably only fully be known when either Tony Hall or George Osborne, God forbid, write their memoirs. Suffice it to say that both the BBC executive, Tony Hall, and the Trust, through Rona, needless to say, declined to agree within 2 hours and entered into a series of frenetic discussions by phone and face-to-face with DCMS and with the Treasury, meetings with George Osborne himself over the following 5 days. The end result, as we know, was some further concessions to the BBC, that the transfer of responsibility would not be immediate, but would take place progressively over the following 5 years. The top slicing would end. The BBC had previously been required to fund rollout of broadband, of high-speed broadband. People who only access BBC content through the iPlayer would have to pay a license fee, which is a very significant gain for the BBC, and that the license fee for the next 5 years would be fixed to inflation, or rather to CPI, having been flat during the previous 2 license fee settlements. Even at the end of that, I have on my person. I have the final draft of a note which Rona wrote to John Whittingdale in the middle of that week, in which she makes clear the, quote, irreversible damage that would be done, and urging that there should be a full public consultation before the government took these steps. By the end of that week, Saturday morning, Tony Hall formally recommended to the BBC Trust that we should accept what the government called a deal. It was never a deal. It was what the government decided to do, and the question is whether the BBC would or would not accept it. Did the DG threaten to resign? I don't know. I've never asked Tony. I've no reason to believe he did, but you must ask him. Did the trustees threaten to resign, as some of them had done in 2010? No, we didn't. Did we talk about it? Yes, we did. We were literally 8 weeks from the start of formal negotiations for the next charter. The Trust had done a great deal of preparation for those charter negotiations, more, I have to say, than I think the BBC executive had done at that time. We were 8 weeks away from those talks. Had we resigned, 12 members of the Trust, there would have been no Trust. We took legal advice. We thought there would be two alternatives for government. One is they would proceed to advertise in accordance with the procedure laid down in the Charter to find 12 new trustees. It's an arcane procedure because it involves all the devolved authorities, ministers in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, as well as ministers in Westminster. The average time it takes to appoint a trustee is about 6 months. There would not have been a trust in place for the first 5 months of the charter negotiations. The BBC executive would have been on its own. There would have been no representative of the licence fee payer. A new trust might have been in place by the end of December 2015. Under the Charter, the BBC ceased to exist 1 year later, the end of December 2016. That trust, why would it have had to hit the ground running to have any significant voice in the Charter negotiations? The other alternative is, even worse in my view, that the government might, if we had resigned, have used an order in council to suspend that part of the Charter relating to the Trust and ask instead that Ofcom should take over responsibility for the BBC. Ofcom does not claim and is not required to be a representative of the licence fee payer. There would have been no representative of the licence fee payer during the Charter negotiations. That, for me and for some of my colleagues, is why we did not resign. I leave it to you and others to decide whether we were right or not. As to the future, which is much more important because we are where we are, I wholly agree with Claire that if we had a strong and stable government in place, this could have been resolved and would have been resolved. Frankly, it would have been easy, almost attractive, for Theresa May to reverse the decision of George Osborne. After all, she was the woman who sacked him. After all, he is the editor who relentlessly calls for her removal from office. It would have been easy. We don't have a strong government. We don't have a stable government. We barely have a government at all, and the government we have is focused on one subject only. It's a really difficult time for the BBC to be trying to engage government on an issue which is vital to the BBC, vital to you, frankly, third-order business for the current government. Claire is absolutely right. There is a golden opportunity to resolve this from 1921-22 with the new licence fee settlement. There is a problem, however. The BBC assumes responsibility for this in 2020. Now, anyone who saw the debate yesterday afternoon, attended by a large number of people from all the opposition parties and an average of 4 members of the Conservative Party, will have seen that the government repeatedly failed to explain why their last manifesto in 2017 pledged to continue free licences for the over 75s throughout this Parliament, in other words, to 2022. Why did they promise that when they'd already said it was a BBC responsibility from 2020? I can tell you why. You remember the circumstances under which the manifesto was drawn up in Downing Street in a hurry in 2015? They cut and pasted an entire paragraph from the previous manifesto. Look them up. It's the same paragraph. Nobody realised that they were committing themselves to free licences when they'd already lumbered the BBC with providing them from 2020 onwards. That's why. And that's why government ministers, 2 government ministers, ducked the question, why are you not keeping to your promise in the manifesto? Because they never intended to make it. So the question is, how do we get through the first 2 years before the licence fee settlement of 21-22 can take effect? And in that, I think we're going to enlist support of everyone who cares about the BBC, everyone who cares about the welfare of older people. That includes everybody in this room, including my colleagues to left and right.
Thank you, Richard. Excellent account. I'm going to come to the audience now, so I'm sure there'll be some questions or comment. Simon Albury.
There's one right there.
As the session, Simon Albury, I've been very pleased to be able to find Claire's article on open democracy, and now I know I'm officially an old person. I look forward to reading it later, because I can't absorb it all now. But I have a specific question for Claire, is that she refers to 2021-22 for licence review. I wonder what she can tell us about the mechanism and timetable for licence review.
Thank you so much. That's a very interesting question, Simon. I think that's going to be determined by political factors. We have a pretty clear idea that if the existing slightly or completely dysfunctional situation continues until the next election in 2022, that I think it's going to be a given that this government would continue to impose conditions on the BBC and to decide with minimal consultation what the service package should be and how much license fees should be, and that the massive pressure we have seen on the BBC income in all the license fee settlements, because I think, as we all know, there are always these swings and roundabouts, but it's a very complex picture also because the number of households has risen. So I'm not saying the BBC doesn't lose on everything, okay? Number of households rise, it's been good for the BBC. The conversion of the iPlayer people has been good. On the other hand, there's been a massive increase in evasion. So to my mind, I would like the VLV, I would like to echo the VLV and champion the VLV, and myself will encourage all the newspaper people, all the press people to advocate a open consultation on the license fee of the BBC, because I think that the way that the BBC license fee should be set is by the public. And I think that, I mean, obviously at a set base. So that would be my preference, is for removing the legal responsibility from a group of people who really don't understand the value of the BBC in most people's lives, or who fail to understand the importance of having the money to deliver the remit. So I think that would be my preference. But as we know, if this juggernaut rolls on, the BBC will be under pressure. And whether, I cannot believe that the government's going to let this terrible issue fall on its head. I just can't believe it. I just can't see why they would outrage all those millions of people. So I'm still incredibly hopeful that this is somehow going to be averted. But without that, I think we won't.
Claire, sorry to interrupt. Don't you think the outrage will need to come first before the government will move? In other words, at the moment, the BBC board, I think, has said that it will take a decision on the result of its consultation before the summer break. I think in Parliament, Minister said it would be next month. I'm not sure the BBC's been quite that specific. I think they've said before the summer break. Whatever decision the BBC takes, of all the options, they're all awful. It's only, it's only a question of how awful they are. Doesn't the BBC have to take that awful decision to motivate enough people, to put enough pressure on government to recognise that this is catastrophic, either for the BBC or for a very significantly large number of pensioners?
Well, I think that, I'm afraid that it has always been enormously awful. I think Caroline and I, when we discussed this issue, I mean, what we really identified was that the government was just basically in a situation of basically looking at an express train coming without any room for maneuver. And I think that was one of the reasons why we felt it was so important to get the support of the Mirror. So I think we've had the outrage. We've also seen over 1 million people walk against Brexit, and the government is completely indifferent. I think, Gordon and I have discussed this many times. We're so thrilled that the Age UK petition got over 100,000. Without the Mirror, it wouldn't have happened. Without the Guardian, we had some real help. We've had the outrage. We are outraged, but it's so big as an issue. And also, I have to say, the BBC's own consultation was so cagey and so complicated that I'm really struggling to think that many people, I mean, I have 2 degrees, were really cruising through it. I just don't think they were. So I think the BBC's own consultation is a tremendous missed opportunity. However, the BBC itself, we know, while the government has the power that it has over the BBC must be incredibly cautious, and it cannot stimulate. That's why Caroline, the Mirror, the Guardian have been trying to stimulate. And I can tell you, these people are completely indifferent. They are. Margot James is indifferent.
I'm
Right?
not
is indifferent.
suggesting for a moment that the BBC
Can I
tries
just take
to...
another, first speaking from the floor, I'll come back to you at the end, Richard, if you would.
Sorry.
This young person here.
Thank you. I'm Laurianne Robinson. I'm with the IBT. Really interesting to hear some of your suggestions for what happens going forward. But as Richard said, I think this only really becomes a real headache for government if the board takes the really tough decision and says we are not going to continue the license fee payment in 2020. Because at that point, then Margot James then has to make a decision about what she does, what government will do. And so as we're in the last phase of the board and its deliberations, we, IBT, are putting together an open letter, and we're trying to rally support and encouraging the BBC's board, who we agree should not be making this decision, to say, this is a moment for you to be brave, to back the BBC and to take the decision to protect the BBC's budget, not because we want the license fee to end, but because we want the government to take it on, and the only way they will do so is if you're brave in this moment. So if anyone is interested in signing on to that letter, then please come and see me, and we'd love to have your name, we'd love to have your signature, and we'd love to put it together fairly shortly so that it can have an impact.
Could
Thank
we
you.
give our emails to VLV and you do it that way rather than have it, then you get in touch with that? Might be easier for people to be hit. Gentleman at the back, yep.
Thank you, Robert Beveridge, University of Sassury. My understanding is the BBC board are going to make an announcement next month. And I would like to encourage everybody in this room to write a letter, not an email, to their Member of Parliament, but also directly to David Clemente, urging that they don't make a decision next month, because who knows how long this dreadful government's going to last. And I certainly myself, professionally and personally, support Claire's suggestion that this issue is parked until 21-22 and it's included in the next licence fee settlement. That is win-win for everybody, but you need to lobby now, because otherwise the BBC board might well make this decision in the next few weeks.
I don't think the BBC has an option not to take a decision, unless government does something in the next few weeks. Fact is that from June next year, the BBC is responsible either for ending this benefit, for varying it, or for paying up £750 million a year. I understand the BBC has been told that the mechanisms that need to be put in place to enable any of that to happen will take up to a year. They don't have the luxury of delaying a decision until September and hoping something miraculous will happen under either this Prime Minister or a new Prime Minister. They have to take a decision. Whichever decision they take will be unpopular, but it won't be the BBC's fault that it's unpopular.
The government could fall any day and the policy then changes.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
what I'm asking is
Yeah.
for the BBC publicly
Yeah.
to be brave, the BBC board, and say, given the circumstances,
What?
let's wait.
Wait and do what? Just wait, and then in a year's time, what happens?
Argue for Claire's proposal, which is you don't put the cart before the horse, you decide what the BBC is for, then you do the funding.
Everyone agree. I mean,
We all
I
agree.
agree entirely.
We
with
all
Claire.
agree.
It's how to make it happen.
We all
I think.
agree. We've got to make it happen.
The
Come
question
on, let's
is,
just write
that
to make
happens.
it happen.
That happens from 1922. From 2022, it doesn't happen from 2020. This problem is 2020. It's 13 months from now.
Caroline.
I was
Funding for an extra year if the government makes that decision.
Correct.
They did.
I was
Correct.
just going to
Caroline.
say my last contact, which admittedly was probably 7, 8 weeks ago, with a senior BBC person who's been my liaison point, led me to feel that they were minded to play a longer game if they could. which of course would be eminently sensible for the reasons you suggest and because of the volatility. So it's interesting to hear that you say that you think you've heard that they might make a decision in the next month.
No, I said an announcement.
Okay, an announcement, because the last thing I'd heard led me to believe that it might not be it wouldn't be as soon as that they were going to, which would be the very pragmatic thing to do. But your comments lead me to think I ought to tap up my colleague and see what the
Both the ministers who spoke yesterday said they thought the BBC would make its decision next month. I think they're wrong about that. I think, like Caroline,
we've got to go for the
a little bit later than that.
There's a question down here, please.
Hi there, I'm Matthew Moore from The Times. Both Caroline and Claire have strongly hinted that means testing is perhaps the most likely option now if the BBC is to make a decision. What's the basis for that, and would you agree it's the least worst of the three they've thoroughly consulted on?
Well, I don't think it's the best one. I think we've made our position clear, as you know, Matthew, from reading our work, that we don't think the BBC should have any part of this concession, and that we, in fact, actually said that we did not want to debate. When we wrote our note, we actually said we're just not even going to discuss the feasibility of any of these options. They all have benefits and weaknesses if you're trying to solve a £745 million problem on paper. But they don't take account of all the issues that Caroline and I understand very well, which is about the fabric of life and fabric of culture and the lifeline and the particular issues, which I'm so glad Caroline highlighted, which is that 1/3 of people who who could get pension credit do not get it. And we think that this would be fall particularly hard on women who are living alone, right? They would be the people who are least likely, because they are the least likely to apply for pension credit. So no, we're not in favor of that at all. But what I'm saying is, on paper, if you're trying to shift 745 million, the least worst option is to shift all but 28% of it, okay? That's all. I mean, there was also the one, we haven't even discussed that, about raising the age to 80, or 85 or whatever. There are a number of different things. I agree with Caroline that, the actual decision of the BBC must be taken in conjunction with the government, and who knows what the government situation or bandwidth for this is going to be. And let's just hope that someone draws back from this and says, why upset so many millions of people? Because if the BBC, means testing all this, essentially if the BBC decides to take away the concession, which is effectively what it has done, it has already decided to say, we're taking away the concession, we have these three options. But taking away the concession is going to be a shock to the senses of people who hear that, right? Because it's kind of soft in the consultation. So I think it's going to be a shock, and I don't want the BBC to be carrying the effect of that shock.
Can I just say, sorry, just to clarify, I don't think it's very likely that the BBC will go for means testing. Frankly, from the BBC's perspective, I think it'd be totally bonkers to go for means testing. Yeah. I don't like it because it will hurt older people. But really, does the BBC want to be in charge of looking at people's individual financial information? It would probably make a jolly bad job of it. It's a very good broadcaster. What leads us to think that it would be good at administering a benefit? Essentially, I think that would be a very perverse outcome, actually. But we just don't like any of those options because they all hurt different groups.
We're getting to the end. I'll come back to each of you finally, but there are two questions here. We take them both together, all the two comments. One's in front of the other.
Vincent Porter, VLV. I think you're all playing chicken. First of all, Caroline is wrong. I got a letter the other day saying I was entitled to an extra 25p a week pension
because you're 80.
Because I'm going to be 80.
Yeah, that's true. So that's the other one.
That's the other one.
Yeah.
But secondly, there is a broader debate going on about the relationships between different generations in this country. And there have been various suggestions that the older generation have too many benefits compared with younger generations. This is not a debate that the BBC has taken up seriously. Thirdly, it seems to me that if the BBC actually put programmes on the air which said, this is what the government is telling us to do, what do you think about it? and actually get government politicians to come and be interviewed and say, if they won't come and be interviewed, they won't come. Let's get this out in the open. Let's open up the debate. And quite frankly, I don't think the government has got a leg to stand on, bust and broken though it is.
David Pollock, rather similar points. Why has the BBC been so pusillanimous over this? There was no sense that they had not agreed to it back in, was it 2015? It appeared to the public to be an agreement that they would take it on. The public have no sense of the dimensions of the problem. The consultation document was completely useless. It was obscure, complicated, and didn't, state the matter of principle at all. And they're not saying anything. They've not raised the matter in public. The BBC says that it's really worried about not appealing to the younger generation. This will be the final caput for their appeal to young people.
To old people.
Louise,
Old people. Old people.
and then we'll round up on the panel. Thank you.
Sylvia.
Yeah, Sylvia, sorry.
Sylvia Harvey, University of Leeds. Please forgive me because I missed the beginning of the session and I'm also not at all privy to what's happening behind the curtains of government. But it seems to be the strongest argument is that the decision about the licence fee is essentially a political decision. It's a decision that must be made by political parties. And therefore, only at a general election could this finally be decided. And given that the amount of money is not huge in government terms, why could the government not agree to pay up until the next general election, thereby giving it the chance to rethink its wording in the last manifesto, which seems to have been a bit of an error, mistake. So it could put that right by deciding properly what it wants to do in 2022. Or, of course, there might be an election before that, but if there isn't, 2022 is the general election date. And because this is a political decision and should never have been given to a broadcaster that has impartiality obligations, it's a decision about welfare spending. Yeah. It's a political decision. I just keep saying it's a political decision. Therefore, it should be taken as general election. Anyway, I'm sorry, that may not help, but that's...
Can I just point out that I asked John Whittingdale this question earlier this year, and he actually said to me that there's no legal force to the manifesto and they can write any old thing in it, and that they did not feel obliged to actually honor this commitment at all. I was just shocked. He said, do you think actually voters read the manifesto, Claire?
Well,
I said,
the current Prime Minister, as opposed to the former Secretary of State, would have slightly higher standards of honour.
Well, we'd hope so, but they would. Now, could I just, from each of you, I mean, the points that we had there were, why doesn't the government do the right thing? From Sylvia, well, we'd like that, but how can that be brought about? Is it by outrage? Is it by the BBC being less pusillanimous, standing up and even using its own airwaves to make this cry? It's hard to do that in many ways. And how do we get into what everyone seems to agree is the better solution, which is a long game? Is somehow the government, it could be a discussion between the BBC and the government to say, let's decide it for 2 years' time, and in the meantime, find some way of funding it.
Yeah. Do you want me to start?
Please do.
Okay. I think to a degree the ball is now in the BBC's court. Obviously, ourselves are doing our best to generate as much noise as we can through the media. I think it's worth noting that I think it's fair to say that all the opposition parties in Westminster are opposed to the government on this. Indeed. It's quite unusual, including the DUP, interestingly, who are on the record as they have, as I'm sure you know, have somewhat jaundiced view of the BBC and the licence fee. So they had a dilemma, what do they hate the most, this policy or the licence fee? They decided they hated the policy most, I'm pleased to say, with a bit of help and persuasion from my colleagues. So actually, it's interesting to note how isolated the government is on this issue, and given the volatility, that I think has to give us a bit of hope. But I think in the end, the ball is in the BBC's court. I think what I would sort of politely say about that, I think, is that a fudged solution from the BBC doesn't help anybody. It won't help us, frankly, in making it absolutely clear that in the end this is the government's responsibility. It will then simply lead to a debate about the details. So I hope whatever decision the BBC board comes up with, they will bear that in mind. What we've always wanted really is a fair fight with the government over this. Our big issue is if the government wishes to change this entitlement, that of course is entirely a matter for the government, but don't do it behind closed doors in a backhanded sort of deal. Do it publicly and let's have a proper debate about it. Of course, they don't wish to do that because they know how difficult that would be. But you can see why, particularly for Age UK, that's a very dangerous precedent and one we're very keen to ensure that future governments don't think, oh, that was a good idea, was it? I also think whatever decisions are made over the next few months and years, this issue isn't going away. There will be plenty of hard luck stories. You know, if the worst happens and the concession goes, there will be plenty of difficulties, issues and problems to do with this in the years to come. It's not going away, either for the BBC or, I hope, for the government. So I'm pretty confident that in the longer term we'll get to a much better place on it. But clearly, you know, you're here because you care passionately about the future of our broadcaster and broadcasting, and I think you have every reason to be very worried about that in the short and medium term.
Richard, you described the brutality of a chancellor when he wants to take some money away.
Yes.
Is it very likely that any other chancellor is going to give it back again?
At the risk of sounding like Theresa May, if Parliament could bring itself to agree an orderly departure from the EU, then thanks to a whole series of positive moves in the public finances, the Chancellor actually has quite a lot of money, which at the moment he can't spend for fear that we do end up leaving the EU without a deal, and then he needs a buffer of billions and billions and billions of pounds. Once we get a deal, I'm not arguing for the deal, let that be on the record, okay? I'm not arguing for any particular deal, but if the UK were to leave with a deal which enables markets to stabilise and goods to be traded in a relatively free fashion, then the Chancellor, he's already committed, actually, to spending money to start to ease austerity. This is a perfect example of austerity. It's austerity that led to this crazy move by George Osborne. So it's not impossible that the money will be found. It is, I think, impossible, or very unlikely, that it's going to be found within the next 8 or 10 weeks, by which the BBC, and I'm sorry to repeat this, has to take some decision, even if it hopes that the decision it takes is then overturned because there is such a political and public outcry at the possible consequences. I think it's very unlikely the BBC board will go for means testing. It's the least attractive option for all sorts of reasons. The most attractive of these very unattractive beauty parade of options is to vary the age at which people become eligible, because nobody's mentioned this so far, for reasons that nobody understands. The Digital Economy Act, which was passed a year and a half after Osborne did this, actually doesn't talk about 75. It gives the BBC the obligation to decide its policy on people over 65 in paying their licence fees. That's what the Digital Economy Act says. Nobody admits to having put it in there, but that's the age which is in the Act. There was never a logic to Gordon Brown choosing 75. It doesn't correspond to any other state benefit. It's not when you get your free bus passes. It's not when you get your state pension. It's not where you get double your heating allowance. How did he get to 75? The answer is he calculated how much money he could afford and divided it by the number of people and came up with 75. So the most defensible of these unpalatable options is for the BBC to change, i.e. raise the age to perhaps 80, which is an age at which some other benefits kick in. But there will be outrage, and rightly so.
I think there's a much better solution than all this. It's
Good.
so simple.
Good. Be quick, if you would, because we've got...
Just make it taxable. That's the end of the story. Those who can afford it will pay, and those who can't will carry on receiving it.
Claire, would you...
Well, I hate to disagree with my neighbour, but I think that his proposal would actually still land the BBC with £500 million a year of expenditure, and that would be all of radio gone. I can't be in favour of that. No, I'm with Caroline that I think the government, it will loom on the government's mind that this could be a real vote loser and that they don't know when a next general election will happen. And this would be something that would give very clear advantages to the SNP, the DWP, and sorry, not the DWP, the Labour Party, a number of big campaigners in this area, and they would be making hay. I mean, certainly from what I've heard from Gordon Brown, this has been a real focus of the Labour Party, is in making sure that people on the doorstep understand what the difference is in terms of their policy in assisting the elderly compared to this government's. So the I have to say the Labour Party has been tremendous on this because they've clearly positioned this issue as way away from the BBC, and the BBC is, okay, responsible for only falling over for whatever reasons they did, and I'm sure having lived through that week, that it was incredibly difficult for the BBC to resist everything. So I'm very hopeful that Caroline and I's, that there will be a fudge, and then that fudge will disappear the issue into down the road, and then obviously as we know, there are many different political complexions to the future of the UK. I myself vote in Scotland for the SNP. I have no problem saying that. I can tell you the SNP is going to play a very significant role in the future of this country, and I hope so.
Sorry, I must correct Claire, you misunderstood me, not willfully, I'm sure. I'm not advocating moving to 80. I'm saying the BBC has to take a decision. There are a range of decisions. If it were to go to 80 and say, that is what we are going to be forced to do next June, and in return we will lose BBC 2, we will lose BBC 4, we will lose local radio, that is the consequence. That is the decision which will force government to address the issue. That is the decision which enables Newsnight and the Today programme to get all these people on the air and grill them. BBC can't use its own programmes to promote its own cause. No. That's forbidden by the Charter. It can report current events, including what happens to over 75's licences.
Well, we've had a very clear exposition of the problem. I'm not sure we're going to walk out of here with our hearts beating more likely, but I think I'd like you to thank our extremely excellent panel for that.